So this is a picture of Frederic Bastiat from a book that was published during his lifetime. Here is a statue that was erected to him in 1878 in a small French town in the southwest called Mougron. And in that town, no one has ever heard of Bastiat. In fact, most of France have never heard of Frederic Bastiat. And so when in 2001, there was the bicentennial of his birth in 1801, a number of American and French economists and political theorists, along with a very, very small handful of French people who knew about Bastiat, gathered in Mougron to celebrate, or to commemorate his life and his work. And the townspeople were just mystified. Who is this Bastiat? They said, well, you have a statue of him in your town square. I said, yes, but that's just for the pigeons, right? And so this is a very curious thing. That, in the United States, in the second half of the 20th century, Bastiat's name was known to some degree. His books were kept in print by the Foundation for Economic Education, and they sold, and they were known, particularly amongst conservatives in the US. But in France, he died. He not only died physically, but his ideas have died. And this is something that we're trying to rectify. Perhaps because if we can show this continuing interest in his ideas by Americans, the French might think, well, there must be something about this man that we should look into. I was talking to one of the leaders the leader of a think tank in Paris called the Molinari Institute. And she said that they have made a significant breakthrough in their dealings with the press. When she started the Molinari Institute about 8 years ago, the press didn't want to know about free market ideas, and they never would talk to her or consult with her. Now, the sea change that's come about is that now an increasing number of people in the press, in the TV and newspapers and so on, come to her to get a free market take on issues. And this had never happened before. They don't agree with any of the ideas, but they feel obliged to at least ask, what is the free market perspective? And Cecile Philippe, who runs this Molinari Institute, said that that's only part of our problem. The other part of our problem is that most French people think that free market ideas are wicked Anglo-Saxon ideas, which the Anglo-Saxons, like in Britain and the United States, have invented for world domination. And we, as French nationalists, don't want to be dominated by the US or by any Anglo-Saxon country, therefore we don't believe in free market ideas. And what's interesting is that the French don't actually know it, but in the 19th century, they had one of the richest and most flourishing classical liberal free market traditions in the world. And we're trying to, with our work at Liberty Fund, to try and resurrect that and to make it better known. So so Cecile Philippe and her colleagues in Paris can say, no, in fact, this is a domestic, homegrown ideology of free market. It's not something that's imposed on us by these wicked Anglo-Saxons. Let me say something a little bit about Bastiat, because he's the person this society is named after. So the question is, why name the society after him? Is someone who's completely forgotten in France, largely forgotten or not known about in the rest of the world. Some people in America have known about him since World War II, but that's not a great number of people. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background about who he was, what he did, why he's important, and to say something about some of his ideas. And I want to make sure that everyone has a copy of this leaflet here, because I'll be talking about this towards the end of my lecture. We're going to examine that. So I'll hand that out to people who haven't already got one. So he was a campaigner for free trade, he was a political economist and a politician during the 1848 revolution. So he's a man of many talents. This is a fairly typical quote from his writings. And what's interesting, I think, about this is he's not just about economic freedom. He says that we have many, many different kinds of freedom. We have individual freedom, we have social freedom, we have economic freedom, we have political freedom, and these are all part of an integral whole. And if you want to defend one kind of freedom, like economic freedom, you also have to defend all the other kinds, because they're tied together, and if one fails or one is ignored, the whole house of cards comes down. And this is something he says here. He's writing a book, and is having troubles getting his thoughts together. He's also suffering from a terminal case of throat cancer, which eventually kills him in 1850. So in 1847 he writes this letter to himself. So it's rather ironic and self-reflective, and that says something about his style and his way of thinking. So this is on the freedom to work and trade. He says, "My dear Frederic," writing to himself, "like you, I love all forms of freedom, and among these the one that is the most universally useful to mankind, the one you enjoy each moment of the day and in all of life's circumstances, is the freedom to work and to trade. I know that making things one's own is the fulcrum of society and even of human life. But it's not just about selfish improvement, betterment of getting money or possessions. It's about, this is like a linchpin or a foundation stone for society itself, human life. And that's one reason why property rights are so important and free economies are so important. I know that trade is intrinsic to property and that to restrict the one is to shake the foundations of the other." Very interesting quotation. And he continues in this letter to himself, where he tries to link all these different types of freedom together into one. He says, "All forms of freedom go together. All ideas form a systematic and harmonious whole, and there is not a single one whose proof does not serve to demonstrate the truth of the others." And that's why he was a political economist. He wrote not just about economic theory, but also about the political implications or the political foundations upon which a society must rest if you want to have prosperity, if you want to have a thriving economy. The Liberty Fund is has taken on this monumental task of translating his collected works in 6 volumes. This is volume 1. They're all going to be about 500 pages long, so about 3,000 pages. He wrote these 3,000 pages between 1844 and 1850 when he died. He did nothing of significance up until 1844, and suddenly he exploded. This dervish of writing, a writing machine, and this is very interesting. We have 6 volumes based upon thematic works. Volume 1 came out, and Volume 2 has also come out. The general editor is Jacques de Gonab, and I'm the academic editor. This is the town square in Mugron, by the way, on the cover. And these are the 2 books. Now, I have a copy of each of those volumes to give away to the person who knows the most about Frederic Bastiat. And to be fair, I'm going to ask you some questions. And if you can answer the questions, you get a free copy. Okay. What is Frederic Bastiat's famous definition of the state? Anybody know? Yes, sir.
The great fiction by which everyone tries to live at the expense of everyone else.
Exactly right. Volume 1 is correspondence. Volume 2 is his political writings like The Law and the State. Which one would you like?
Let me go with number 2, please.
You may have that. And one of the interesting things about this book is the very lengthy glossaries at the back which explain who all these people were who were writing in the 1840s. Okay, second question. Drum roll, please. What was the title of the book Frederic Bastiat left unfinished at his death? Can I take us?
Come on, Eric.
No, I'm exempt.
Now, staff are not allowed to participate in this competition. It was the economic harmonies.
That's the one you mentioned.
The follow-up question to that, which I was going to ask, but seemed pointless now since no one knew the first answer to the second question. But I'll ask it anyway. What was the original working title Bastiat had for the economic harmonies? This is for the experts.
Not Karl Marx.
No. It was called Social Harmonies, which is quite interesting. Another question. What was Bastiat's other first name? Everyone knows him as Frederic Bastiat. Anyone know? Because Europeans like to have lots of first names. Like the more the better. Claude Frederic Bastiat. So he's Claude. This one might be a bit easier for you. In one of Bastiat's best-known essays in the Economic Sophisms is about something that got broken. What got broken?
The broken window.
Now, I don't know who won that. Do we have an adjudicator?
Give it there. Get a vote.
Anyone see who won that one? Okay, a decider. Who will break the tie? Whose window got broken?
Bakers. Yeah.
We need hands raised, people. Come on.
Yeah. Whose window got broken?
Yellow shirt, I think.
Bakers.
No.
I don't know if I said it first, I guess.
Jacques Bonhomme.
Oh, my name.
Oh.
All right. And Jacques Bonhomme is the generic name for the everyday, every person Frenchman. Like John Bull is the everyday person in England. Today, what would the equivalent be?
Joe Smith, John Doe.
Joe Sixpack, yes, something like that. So, his window gets broken. Who breaks the window?
His son.
Exactly.
What was the answer?
His son.
His son broke the window.
His
And,
good-for-nothing laid-out hooligan son.
and contributed to the economy by doing so.
We're going to get to that. You can buy these from Liberty Fund up through the catalogue, and please take one. They're very beautifully made books, subsidised, so the price is very reasonable. They're also available free online at the Online Library of Liberty website. But if you're like me, you like to search and browse online and then have your own personal copy to write graffiti and other interesting comments.
Can you get those on Kindle or any type of electronic media?
Yes. Go to the Liberty Fund bookshop, the online shop, and you can buy stuff there. The Online Library of Liberty has a whole lot of stuff about Bastiat, and he's person number 25. So that's the URL, libertyfund.org/person/25. And we have timelines, essays, and so on. You can also go to the Liberty Fund corporate website where you can buy books and stuff like that, libertyfund.org. This is my personal website where I put masses of stuff. I'm trying to collect together all this French classical liberal material. And it's davidmhart.com/liberty. You can find out about it. And I have a Bastiat page with all the resources, and it's davidmhart.com/liberty/Bastiat. And you can find all sorts of interesting stuff there. I just recently published a book, which is interesting because it shows that there's a kind of renaissance taking place right now, which is very encouraging, in interest in 19th century French classical liberal thought. And Routledge has published this extremely overpriced academic book, edited by me and Robert LaRue of the University of Ottawa, called French Liberalism in the 19th Century, $135, so you understand if you don't buy one immediately. But we also have a contract to do a French language edition, which is going to be bigger with more stuff. And again, this is mysterious. Why is this interest? We're trying to be entrepreneurs and cash in on this, obviously. Sell at least 20, make our fortune. I'm also an evangelist for Bastiat, and what I suggest is that every single executive director of Bastiat Society have a Bastiat license plate for their state. Ben Rast has one for South Carolina.
I concur, by the way. I've had somebody in my household maybe say that's not the best idea, but...
I didn't ask anyone in my household, I just did it. And funnily enough, when I went onto the Department of Motor Vehicles website, no one else in Indiana had a Bastiat license plate. I was just flabbergasted. I couldn't believe it.
Did you ever hear the story about Ben Rast and he got cornered in the parking garage? And
No.
And the lady goes, okay, I've been looking at your license plate for a long time. I understand that you got a bachelor's of arts and science. But what school is TIAT? I never heard of it.
I know you can make all sorts of jokes. But Ben Rast and I have this dream that eventually there will be 50 Bastiat Societies in all 50 states, and every director will have a Bastiat license plate, and we will have a convention in Las Vegas, and we'll all drive there, and there will be a car park with 50 cars with Bastiat license plates. That's our dream.
You've got to have goals, David.
Got to have goals, indeed. Yeah. So some of the things that I want to talk about, and I'll give you a survey of his life because it's sort of interesting in shaping him and his ideas. But since we're not historians here, I'll be fairly brief. And I want to leave some time at the end to talk about this particular and his most famous economic sophism about the broken window and why it is still relevant today, so many years afterwards, after he wrote it. So, just to give you a brief survey of why I think he's so important, that he not only was one of the pioneers of the French classical liberal tradition, he was influential in so many ways, and then his life was cut short by this dreadful throat condition, which I think was cancer, but it's a bit hard to tell, medical practice being what it was then. He was best known today, if he's known at all, as perhaps the best economic journalist who's ever lived. Right? He was a stunningly brilliant stylist and a polemicist. But beneath his satirical comments and his wit and his puns, there was this deep and economic understanding of the world, which comes through when you read it, perhaps for a second time. The first time you read it because it's amusing and clever. He was also interesting, and this is what differentiated so much of the French classical liberal tradition from the English classical liberal tradition, was that they became increasingly utilitarian, based on the idea that someone, somewhere, often in a government, could calculate how to maximise human happiness, and we could pass laws to improve the total amount of human happiness in the world. We might take a little bit from you, but your unhappiness is not very great, but we give that to everyone else, increasing everyone else's happiness, and the total happiness of the room rises. Therefore, taking your property and giving it to everyone else is a good thing. And Bastiat and the French classical liberals, who were in a different tradition, which was still very much a natural rights tradition, said, that may be, but we actually disagree that that's the case. But even then, it's unjust to take someone else's property without their permission. And so it was based upon this sort of moral passion, and that's something that Bastiat combined very nicely in his writings, this desire to end poverty and oppression, but also to defend justice. And the two were linked together in this intimate way. He was also quite extraordinary in that he combined a whole lot of very difficult things in one short time span. As I said, he was between 1844 and 1850. He was active in a single issue movement, which was the free trade movement in France. He started a free trade society in France. He was an economic journalist, and that's what he's best known for today. He got elected to political office during the French Revolution of 1848, twice. And he was appointed by the Chamber of Deputies to be the vice president of the Finance Committee, which is very influential, important position. He was also increasingly becoming a theoretical economist, trying to write a magnum opus where he would draw together all his ideas into one treatise of economics called The Economic Harmonies. And unfortunately, half of it was published in his lifetime, and then the second half was gathered from his papers by his colleagues and friends and published in the second part in 1851. He was a courageous man of principle. You can't say that about most economists. And I say that because he was actually on the streets of Paris during the Revolution when people were being shot by the army for rioting. And he didn't agree with what they were writing about because they wanted to introduce socialist redistribution programs, known as the National Workshops, which would be a government-funded unemployment program. And Bastiat totally opposed this for all the good free market reasons that one can think of. But when the people started rioting, when the National Workshops were closed down in June of 1848, people who supported the government's welfare program rioted in the streets, and the French army was called in to shoot them. And we don't know exactly how many were killed, but it might have been 1,500, 2,000. Bastiat was in the streets trying to stop the troops shooting his ideological enemies. He said, I disagree with what they're writing about, but there's no reason to shoot them. And he threw himself literally in front of the troops and said, at least give us time to pull the dead and dying off the barricades and take them to shelter and give them support if we can. And he did this twice in 1848. So that's why I say he was a courageous man of principle. Can you imagine many politicians today who would do that? If there was rioting in the streets of Washington, how many of our politicians would be in the streets trying to rescue their ideological opponents? A number of people in the Austrian economics world, like the Mises Institute, see Bastiat as a precursor, as a proto-Austrian economist, because a number of his insights were developed later on in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, by the so-called Austrian school, like Mises, for example. And that you can, in fact, see premonitions or early formulations of some of these ideas, like subjective value theory, in Bastiat's writings. Also, you can see him as a kind of proto-public choice economist, because he was very interested in applying economic analysis to the behaviour of politicians. Now, why did they do what they do? Why do vested interests do what they do? And although he didn't tie it all together into a coherent public choice theory like Buchanan did, you can see many of those insights appearing in his work. And then you can also see the impact that Bastiat had in the formation of the modern libertarian movement, starting with Leonard Reed, who at one stage was the president or the director of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. And he gave a talk once talking about free trade and free market ideas, and someone came up to him after the lecture and said, "You know, you really sound like Bastiat." And Leonard Reed said, "Who the hell is Bastiat? Never heard of him." And he read Bastiat and he said, "Yes, you're right. I'm saying exactly what Bastiat did." And one of the great things that Fee did was to translate into English and to keep in print a whole series of Bastiat's works, starting in the 1960s. And that's going to be made out of date by our edition, because we're doing everything that Bastiat wrote. So there's at least a doubling of material that has never been translated into English. Henry Hazlitt at the Wall Street Journal knew about Bastiat and wrote columns in the Wall Street Journal defending free market ideas based upon a lot of Bastiat's insights. He even wrote Economics in One Lesson, which is the subtitle of one of Bastiat's books. The first chapter of his Economics in One Lesson is called The Broken Window Fallacy, which is one of Bastiat's most famous ideas. And then, of course, we have Murray Rothbard, who thinks that Bastiat is a very important theorist. And we also have Ronald Reagan. So what's Ronald Reagan doing in this? This is fairly not well researched, but some people think that Reagan believed that Bastiat was one of the most influential people that he ever read, and that he would refer to him in some of his speeches, and that in some of his letters he would refer to Bastiat. So perhaps Bastiat was one of the people who was driving the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s. So that's a wonderful PhD thesis if anyone wants to write it, look at the impact of it. So any budding PhD students out there, please feel free. I have a lot more detail about his biography. I'll try and skip through this. You have to Google map everything, right? Born in Mugron, in this corner of southwest France, near the border of Spain. It's an important wine growing area. The big city just to the north is Bordeaux. There are rivers that flow through here, and he was born in Bayonne, which is on the coast. It's also near the Spanish border. What happens when you live near the coast or an international border and they have tariffs? Free trade, otherwise known as smuggling, goes on. And Bastiat saw that going on around him all the time. And it's also a reason why he was fluent in 4 or 5 languages. Spanish, French. He also learned English because of the free trade movement of Richard Cobden in England. He got interested. He also spoke a bit of Basque. He wrote a few essays on the Basque language, which is quite interesting. So that's where he comes from. He was for the first 43 years of his life, he was a nobody. He was a provincial magistrate, he was a country gentleman farmer, but he belonged to a sort of what we would call a book club. A group of local people would gather together to talk about the newspapers and to talk about books that they were reading. And Bastiat became interested in economics. And he read everything he could get his hands on for 20 years on economics in 4 languages: Spanish, Italian, English, and French. And he did this in the far-flung provinces, southwestern France. And when he decided to write about Economic Matters. He was inspired by Richard Cobden's Anti-Corn Law League, which was got active in 1838 and finally succeeded in having the corn laws abolished in 1846. It was one of the first big free trade pieces of legislation in the 19th century. And Bastiat says, this is fantastic, we've got to do something like that in France. And he set up his own French Free Trade Society. In 1844, he writes this essay comparing French and English tariff policy, and he sends it to the Journal des Economistes, which is this free market journal in Paris. And the Parisian economists say, who is this guy? He knows everything. He's deeply intelligent and thoughtful. And so he goes to Paris, and they just, first of all, they laugh at him because he's a provincial nobody. He wears funny clothes. He has an accent. Not that I have an accent, but I mean, he had a provincial accent, and they mocked him for it until they heard him talk, and they realised that this man is so intelligent, so knowledgeable, and such a good person that we want him to become part of our group. And they welcomed him with open arms, and even offered him the job of being the editor of the Journal des Economistes. But he turned it down because he said, I wanted to concentrate on the free trade movement. In 1847, in the French Chamber of Deputies, there is this big push to reform the tariff laws. And the free traders see this as their big opportunity, but they fail. They get outmanoeuvred in the chamber because the chamber decides to send it to committee. All right, that's sudden death for any proposal, because the people in the committee can then kill the proposal. And the protectionists dominated the committee and were able to scuttle the free trade legislation. And that's when Bastiat turns to something else. He turns more to economics, economic theory. But Bastiat had the fortune, or the misfortune perhaps, of living through two revolutions in France. I mean, France has got having revolutions all the time. It's this embarrassment of riches, especially for historians who love to get their teeth into a good revolution, because that's when things happen. And the first one is the 1830 revolution, when the restored monarchy after Napoleon, the restored monarchy suddenly becomes more and more oppressive in the late 1820s, clamping down on freedom of speech, banning political groups from discussing political issues. And people have decided they've had enough. They chuck out the restored monarchs and want to have a constitutional monarchy. And it brings the so-called July monarchy to power in 1830. Bastiat is in the southwest of France. The regime that had been overthrown in Paris was a branch of the Bourbon family. Another branch of the Bourbon family was the king of Spain. If the Bourbon monarch in Spain decided to come to the help of his fellow Bourbon in Paris, they would come through southwest France. There was a garrison in the southwest of France in the city where Bastiat was born, in Bayonne. If that garrison fell to the pro-Bourbon monarchs, that would allow the Spanish relief to come into France. What does Bastiat do? He decides to go to the garrison and talk the officers into supporting the revolution, because they were in two minds. They said, we gave an oath to the Bourbon monarch. How can we break our oath? So what does Bastiat do? And he has this wonderful letter, and in the book of the correspondence you can read about this. He goes to the garrison to speak to some of the officers in order to swing them to the cause. He writes this letter, and he goes off and has drinks and singing with the officers. He wins them over to the revolutionary cause, and he goes home and writes about it to his friend Felix. And he talks about how they drank red wine and sang the political songs written by this wonderful poet and songwriter, Béranger. And this was what helped persuade the officers to go with the revolution. So here's the letter. This is the 5th of August, midnight. I was expecting blood, but it was only wine that was spilt. It's a glorious scene, that obviously these officers are getting high on local wine and talking about politics and freedom and so on. The Citadel has displayed the tricolour flag. The military containment of the Midi and Toulouse has decided to have Bayonne. The plan has failed. This evening we fraternised with garrison officers. Punch, wine, liqueurs, and above all, Béranger contributed largely to the festivities. Perfect cordiality reigned in this truly patriotic gathering. The officers were warmer than we were, in the same way as horses which have escaped are more joyful than those that are free. He has this great turn of phrase. So who is this Béranger? I had never heard of Béranger until I started working on Volume 1 and trying to track down footnotes. Who were all these people writing glossaries? Béranger was this wonderful classical liberal poet and songwriter. And he used to write these satirical poems about politicians and about the ruling elite. And he was constantly getting into trouble from the censors, and he was thrown in jail several times, which of course just made him write even more. And this is a fairly typical poem by Béranger. And because there was all these controls about political gatherings, people would form private clubs, and they would go to a bar and they would drink, as French people often do, and they would sing these political songs, and the police would be constantly trying to close them down, because you can't have people singing mocking songs about the king. I mean, this is terrible. But this is the sort of typical song that they would have sung, and I think this is something like the song that Bastiat would have sung with the officers in the garrison of Bayonne. And this is mocking Napoleon, or actually a local seigneur who thinks that he is just like Napoleon, and he can do things like tax people at will. And I can't sing this, unfortunately, otherwise I'd bore you silly. This is one verse, and you'll get a sense of how it's a great drinking song. And Bastiat mentions Béranger constantly in his letters. He actually persuaded Béranger, this poet, to join the Free Trade Society. And Béranger was going to be at the dinner welcoming Bastiat to the French political economist circle. So that's how close they were. So the song goes, this is about the king Yvetot. Yvetot is this local seigneur who thinks he has a Napoleonic complex, right? As we would say today. He said, "No costly regal taste," said he, "save thirstiness alone. But before a people blessed can be, we must support the throne. So from each cask of beer, right, or wine, so from each cask new, tapped he got, his own tax gatherer on the spot, a pot." So he was collecting his cut of the production of the wine of the local area. And then, of course, there is the refrain, where you can imagine their glasses in the drinking club. Ha 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 ho 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 ho, a kingdom match with Yvetot, ho 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 ho, and then they down their glass and then they have another one. So that's how no blood was spilt in the Bayonne garrison, but lots of red wine was. And it goes on. I can't sing it, unfortunately. I think what I might do now is skip some of this other biographical material and just go to this section where... Oh, I should say something about this statue. That is the statue that was erected in the town square of Mugron, and that's only part of what the original statue looked like, because the Nazis desecrated it in World War II. And they did it because they wanted the bronze. Why did they want the bronze? Shell casings, other military equipment, and so on. So they tore off. And this is what the thing looked like. This is from an etching from 1878 in a local illustrated newspaper. And here we have. Oops, sorry. This is Bastiat's bust. This was another bronze statue of the personification of fame, and she is writing on the statue of the monolith here the names of all the famous books that Bastiat had written. And of course, what happens was the Nazis had all these bronzes confiscated and melted down during the war, and after the war they found the mould of his bust, so they could redo his head, but they never found the mould of personification of fame, so that's all we have today, which is very sad. Here are some interesting parts of that Bastiats Theory, which I won't have time to go through at any length. I just wanted to mention them. That as part of his economic harmony, and that is, how does the economy work in this harmonious and productive fashion? He was very interested in knowing how this worked, and he does this from an individualist perspective. So So the Austrians think, oh, this is very interesting. He's using an individualist, methodological individualism. He has some interesting theories to say about economic coordination, how millions of people in the city of Paris can be fed because people who supply food to the city have a selfish economic interest in selling their product, but without any central planner, the city of 1 million people can be fed through the wonders of the marketplace. So we don't need central planners to tell us what to do. He also is very keen on free trade and the link that has with peace, and he shared that view with Richard Cobden. And that's very interesting. So that trade and prosperity flourishes best when there is peace. And he's a leading defender of peace in the 19th century. He's also interested in disharmonies, when things aren't allowed to operate in a harmonious way, when government intervention interferes and the economy can break down or become dysfunctional in various ways. And I want to talk, he has a number of theories about subsidies and tariffs are actually theft. And he uses that word. He deliberately uses this provocative word because he really thinks that's what it is. It's a violation of people's rights to take their property. And he said, we have to, the French is, call a cat a cat. The English word is, we have to call a spade a spade. If the government does something that is immoral for an individual to do, it is also immoral for the government to do that. You know, he said, I see no distinction in moral theory between what individuals do and governments do. And he develops this into a new theory of the state. And then this is what I want to talk about in more detail, that destruction and waste is never a net gain to the economy. This is the so-called broken window fallacy. And I want to talk about that. So before I do that, I want to make sure that everyone's got a copy of this. Anyone not get one? Oops, I have two things here.
I'll hand those out.
If you could hand those out. So if you want to find out about some of these other issues, I suggest you go to my website and you can follow the argument there. I came across this cartoon the other day, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. And once you read this, you'll understand what the joke is, because in the story, there's an accidental breakage of a window. But in this cartoon, the Keynesians are so incensed about the correctness of Bastiat's insights that they're throwing rocks through his window, breaking it. And we can see the economic sophisms, a copy of that lying on the table, and Bastiat cursing the damn Keynesians for throwing yet another rock through his window. You'll notice that this is the motto of the Bastiat Society. They've taken ce qu'on voit et ce qu'on ne voit pas. What is seen and what is not seen. And this is a chapter in that book. This is one of the last things that Bastiat wrote on the eve of his death. So it's quite important. And what the argument that Bastiat puts forward in this fairly short essay is that all activities, economic activities, produce a complex series of effects. And some of these are immediately obvious, and he calls these the scene. Right? Everyone sees the scene, right? There's a big debate going on here, I know, about the football stadium. Right? What is seen is that, wouldn't it be great to have a football stadium? Think of all the people who are going to come and visit, buy tickets, go to restaurants and drink in bars. That would be a wonderful boost to the economy. That is the classic scene aspect. But Bastiat says an insightful person, and especially an economist who knows his stuff, will know that there will be other events and consequences that occur sometime later and are often unintended. And he calls these the unseen. So we have this contrast between the seen and the unseen. And everyone, including Paul Krugman, writes a lot about the seen and hardly ever about the unseen. So now you'll be able to engage Krugman in debate and point out his missing part of his economic analysis. So here we have a story about Jacques Bonhomme, Joe Sixpack, a glazier and a shoemaker. And the argument goes like this. What is seen is that Jacques Bonhomme's hooligan son throws a rock through the window and breaks it. So Jacques Bonhomme, I was going to say, rings up the glazier, but of course they didn't have telephones in those days. So he employs the glazier to come and replace the window. And people say, well, isn't this great? I mean, the glazier has more work. He can sell a window. There are people in his business who install windows who will get employment. Isn't this to the good? Bastiat says there's a loss for Jacques Bonhomme, but he has to pay money that he wouldn't have had to if the window hadn't been broken. There's a stimulus to the glazier's business. This is the scene. What is not seen is that not only is Jacques Bonhomme out of pocket, the money that he would have spent on other things doesn't happen. He spends it on replacing the window. He doesn't spend it on buying a new pair of shoes or a chicken for the casserole for the weekend or something else. Right? We don't see these things that don't happen. This expenditure which did not happen. We don't see that. And so people don't take it into their calculations. So by not buying a pair of shoes, there's a loss of business for the shoemaker, and this is not seen. So how do you calculate all these myriad, losses and gains? How do you balance them? Well, Bastiat thought that there was one formula which he could. This is his initial formula, what he called the double incidence of loss. Right, we have a gain for the glazier, which is seen. That's one positive, but there's a double negative or a double loss here. Jacques Bonhomme has to spend money that he wouldn't have normally on a window. He doesn't make a purchase of the new shoes, which he was planning to do. Therefore, the shoemaker makes a loss or doesn't make a sale. And this is the unseen. And so he calls this a double incidence of loss. Jacques Bonhomme and the shoemaker are less well off than they might have been. The glazier is better off. And Bastiat made the assumption that the sum of these two was greater than the gain of that. What Bastiat had in mind was that there are a number of economists who, just like Paul Krugman and other economic journalists, after the Kobe tsunami devastated northern part of Japan, so many economic journalists said, well, we have to remember that there's a silver lining. I mean, there's a loss of property and damage and so on. But think of the stimulus it's going to cause to the construction industry in Japan. They can rebuild their infrastructure and it'll be even better than it was before. Or in the tropical storm Sandy, devastating New York and New Jersey. A very similar argument is being made. Bastiat says there is a loss that will be never restored. Right, like the broken window. There's the destruction of property in Kobe and in New Jersey. And this has gone forever. And even though some sectors of the economy might do better in the short term, there are lots of other things that people would have spent that money on and that has damaged their earnings as a result. Bastiat had in mind here the Great Fire of London. There were some economists. The Great Fire of London broke out in 1666, and the argument was that this in fact stimulated the English economy having to rebuild the parts of London that were destroyed by the fire. And Bastiat says, no, this is just... Destruction of property is never a good idea. This loss has gone for good, and we would have been so much better off if that hadn't occurred and we just kept building and growing and developing our economy. But Bastiat was concerned that this was a very crude arithmetic, and he knew that there was a more complicated problem here to be solved, and he said, well, he used the word ricochet effect. He said, when an economic activity occurs, that's like dropping a stone in a pond, and we see ripples of consequence flow out from where we drop the stone. So when a piece of property is destroyed, there is these losses that spread out from the centre, and as the ripples get smaller and smaller and dissipate, so do the losses get smaller and smaller and dissipate as the consequences of this action go through the economy. He said, I need to be able to figure out what is the sum to the nth power of these gains and losses. And he didn't have the mathematics, so he wrote to the leading astronomer of Paris, in France at the time, put forward his problem. He said, can you develop the mathematics that I need to explain or describe this effect more accurately, more scientifically? Unfortunately, he died, so he was never able to work on this. But I think this is really interesting because this is like an early version of the Keynesian multiplier effect. Only because it's a negative multiplier, it's like a divider. Right? It's not multiplying wealth; it's actually decreasing wealth. So that's one reason why people find Bastiat interesting, but because he died before he could finish a lot of this work, it's all incomplete. So if you want to follow through in the handout, you can find this passage. He says, but if by way of deduction, as is often the case, the conclusion is reached that it is a good thing to break windows, that this causes money to circulate and therefore industry in general is stimulated, I'm obliged to cry, stop! Your theory has stopped at what is seen and takes no account of what is not seen. What is not seen is that since our bourgeois has spent 6 francs on one thing, he can no longer spend them on another. What is not seen is that if he had not had a window pane to replace, he might have replaced his down-at-heel shoes or added a book to his library. You can see where Bastiat's preferences lay, mostly buying books. In short, he would have used his 6 francs for a purpose that he will no longer be able to. And that's the sort of classic formulation of this broken window theory. This is just an elaboration of that, so I won't go into it in any more detail. I wanted to show how this notion might be applied to things today. This is a wonderful cartoon showing us the scene. Our beloved leader, Barack Obama, is creating jobs. He's knitting beautifully. And this sweater or rug that's called jobs. That's what we see. Now, the government's got this program to stimulate the economy. Isn't that a good thing? But where do the new jobs come from? Or where does the money come from for these new jobs? This is the second half of the cartoon. What is not seen is that someone is paying for this in a way that is hard to calculate. Like the taxes might have increased, or regulations might have increased, or inflation might be used to fund this, and this causes the loss of value of other people in the economy. So the private sector might be losing jobs because of the great knitters' activity. So there's the full cartoon, so you can see the effect. And as we can see with the Kobe tsunami and the tropical storm Sandy, is this notion is so deeply embedded in popular thinking and in journalistic thinking. In the case of Krugman, even in Nobel Prize economic thinking. The Bastiat would just pull his hair out. How many times do we have to refute this notion? How many times do we have to point out its absurdities? It's just a never-ending battle. So I'll leave my formal remarks here, but I'll open it up for questions. I should say that we also have, this is the latest Liberty Fund catalogue. If you want a copy, please take one. You can browse through our growing library there. Also here this is what we call the Portable Library of Liberty disc. And it is a subset of the over 1,000 books that we have on the Online Library of Liberty. This is a DVD data disc, so it's not a video that you can stick in your machine and play and watch Bastiat in living colour. This has 1,000 books in PDF, full text, so you can take that with you. That's free of charge. There's also there's a flyer here that describes what's on the Online Library of Liberty and how you might make use of it. So these things, the catalogue, the disc, and then this leaflet are all here for the taking. So I'm quite happy to answer any questions, and then of course at 8 o'clock we retire to the bar for a much deserved drink and a singing of political songs, if that takes your fancy. Yes, sir.
So, was he really the progenitor of the idea of the state as an entity of legal plunder? Were there some antecedents?
Many. You can find all sorts of interesting quotations from people like David Hume, who sees the state as having its origin in very unpleasant activities like conquest and plundering of productive people by less productive people, warrior class.
So was there in some way that Bastiat made it his own unique theory, or was it just a turn of a phrase? Or
he was what he did was he had the turn of phrase to make it more appealing to ordinary readers. Whereas one of the political theorists or economists that influenced him a great deal was a gentleman by the name of Charles Comte. And Comte was writing in exactly the same way in the 1820s and 30s. And Bastiat had read all of the works of Comte. So this is something that is a common parlance in the classical liberal movement in France at this time. There's even a kind of early class theory, seeing the world divided into two antagonistic classes. There is the industrious, productive class who work in the fields, who work in the factories, who produce things of value, who then trade them with other people, thereby increasing everyone's wealth. And then you have a class that's antagonistic to this, which is a kind of parasite. That could be in earlier stages of European history, the slave-owning class, for example, exploiting the workers who were the slaves. Or it could be people like Napoleon and the bureaucratic state that Napoleon created during the late 1790s and early 19th century. Or it could, in Bastiat's own day, he saw it as the people who got benefits from the government through tariff protection and subsidies that had to be paid for through the taxation of hard-working people. And so society was divided into these two classes, and also they were constantly at war, in a way, a struggle. The people trying to keep the taxation and tariffs to a minimum in order to protect their property, and the vested interests in the government always trying to increase taxes and increase tariffs. And so there was this struggle being played out in Parliament, for example. That was Bastiat's explanation. And then when the 1848 revolution broke out, which is where that phrase was first coined, this was actually a revolutionary pamphlet that he wrote in the early stages of the 1848 revolution, when socialists were, for the first time, looked like they could get into power and actually enact some of this legislation to redistribute property. And that was the national workshops, which Bastiat opposed in committee and also on the floor of the Chamber of Deputies. He started his own little revolutionary magazine called Jacques Bonhomme. And he and Molinari and a group of other younger classical liberals printed this material, and the state actually was an early draft. I've included in that handout there. On this little leaflet, which they were standing on the street corners of Paris, handing out to the workers and the rioters, saying, no, don't believe in socialism, you've got to believe in the free market is much better, much more productive, much more just. They even designed it so it could be pasted on the walls of Paris, on the buildings. And you can imagine the socialists going around at night tearing down Bastiat's posters, and the next day Bastiat and others going around putting up new ones. And then he turns it into the essay that we know, which was published in September of 1848 in its more final form. And what we do in our edition of Volume 2, where it's included, we include the draft and then the final version, and then we explain in the footnotes and the glossaries who all these people are that he's referring to. The sort of the second part of the story about class is that Marx had read a lot of the French classical liberals, including Bastiat. He hated Bastiat. He called him the most terrible names in his footnotes. And I went through and did a search of Marx's works, which we have online at the OLL, and found this great long list of abusive things that Marx said about Bastiat. And if someone so irritated Karl Marx, he must be doing something right. But Karl Marx got the classical liberal theory of class back to front. So it's very distressing. So that's one research project. Again, if you want to write a good PhD, do one on the early, the French classical liberal formulation of the theory of class before Karl Marx. Hands on it, and got it all wrong. Yes, sir.
A question that has always bothered me, having read the Broken Window here before, is it all depends on when in time you measure.
Yes.
And it is going to take some alcohol to sterilize my mouth after defending Paul Krugman, but after the storm, it is a net positive, and it is a silver lining that the storm has occurred. But I think the difference between the tsunami, the storm off New Jersey, and the broken window is one is intentional and one is natural. And depending on where you start the clock, that if the storm is going to occur, after the storm has occurred, it is a silver lining that there will be commerce created by it. Not that the storm should be created to create commerce.
It does not outweigh the expense of the storm itself.
Well, you
In
have
fact,
to ask.
square one, or if not worse.
Oh, you're even, but having the storm already occurred.
But it's pervasive because we had cash for clunkers. Remember that? The whole idea was, to stimulate the economy by destroying the good cars, and that. So there, we can still apply that theory.
It's a matter of intentionality, is your point.
Well, I think Bastiat would say it doesn't matter what the intention was, we're looking at the consequences. And he would also make the point, I think, that who benefits and at whose expense. And obviously the people who live in New Jersey and New York who get government subsidies and benefits and so on, their life is improved. They're better off for not having that. But Bastiat would say, look at the bigger picture. Right? If you increase the circle to have a larger radius, the people who are paying the taxes or whatever, they're losing. And they're being made worse off by having their taxes increased so that the people in New Jersey can have their houses rebuilt more quickly. And that's why he wanted to extend his analysis to include not just more people, but I think over time too. And he didn't have the mathematical tools. I mean, this is 1848, not 1948. But I think the thing he would say was that who benefits and who pays, and is it right and proper that the people who benefit and the people who pay. And he would say no, it's a violation of their property rights. Yes.
I would look at this from a point of view of Jacques Bonhomme. I don't know how to pronounce that.
Jacques Bonhomme. Jack Goodfellow.
Let's call him John Goodfellow. From his point of view, he's not concerned with maximizing spending. He's concerned with maximizing his net worth. So before the rock is thrown, he says, I have a perfectly good window, and I have the resources to buy some shoes. After the rock is thrown, he says, I now have a broken window, I need to replace it, and I have to take those resources and repair it. So now you have two possible futures. One where he has a window and the shoes, the other where he has the window and he had to pay for the replacement. He's not better off. Now, the argument is not that we should not repair the damage after Sandy storm. The argument is that it's not actually a net benefit. There's a whole bunch of damage, we've got to repair it. The thing is this, if the storm had not happened, folks in New Jersey, New York would have been spending money on all kinds of other economic activity. So there's no bonus to be had from this rebuilding efforts. It's just focusing our attention on this one area. We're saying, yes, okay, now we're spending all this and we know where it is. But before, we didn't know. They were buying shoes and computers and TVs and who knows what.
You could also say that a disaster like that makes people work harder, but they produce more things because before they were lazy or they were taking recreation and a lot of time and not working. The storm makes them spend more hours working and building things. But criticism of that argument is that people do value their leisure time, right? And so they're losing that valuable thing called leisure and having to work harder in the factory or whatever to make up for the loss. So they're worse off even though they might be working harder. There's some total of assets and their time, their preference for the way they use their time is also an asset that's taken away from them.
But there is a segment that benefits quite. Well, I remember when Katrina hit, and there were people. Within this area, if you had a pickup truck and a chainsaw, you could go down there and make $50, $60 an hour.
Off somebody then.
So
you can claim justice.
But it's a matter if you look at it micro or macro.
To take another example, I would say the retailers in New Jersey lost a lot of money because their Christmas sales of gifts and whatever else may be a higher market in that time of year were slashed. I've seen preliminary numbers on that show it was very well offset. Very much.
There's another sort of story that came out of the Sandy, and that was the shortage of fuel. Because a lot of I said petrol station, but gas stations couldn't supply fuel because they'd lost power and they needed power for the pumps to pump the fuel into the cars. And people then began black markets in gasoline and selling it. And then, of course, the New York government said, no, that's wrong. You can't. Even though there's a shortage and the price will go up, we will fix the prices and make people line up in queues. And that's preferable than paying $5 a gallon or $10 a gallon or whatever. And Mike Munger was on NPR. And Mike Munger is a wonderful free market economist who I believe is coming to speak here next month. He said, I think the best thing that could happen is price gouging. We should allow people to charge $25 a gallon. He said that would eradicate the shortage immediately. There was also another issue of ships only from Gulf, from the Mexican Gulf, could unload refined fuel in New York Harbor. And there were other ships from other countries who could have brought fuel to New York who were banned from doing so because and I thought the Navigation Acts had been abolished hundreds of years ago, but they're in full effect in New York. You had to have an American boat bringing an American produced and refined fuel, and damn the New Yorkers and New Jerseyans, because that's got to support American refineries. And so you could go on and on. About all the distortions that occur.
I'm going to go ahead and say we've got time for 2 more questions.
I think I'm interested in the thrust of what you're doing with the revival of French classical liberal thought and the how you're executing that. I'm interested to know, since there's not a necessarily receptive market, I don't think Poland is going to be purchasing a lot of your books unless you burn them, which would be about right, wouldn't it? How are you going about this insidious, revisionism of current French thought? And
well, driving a car with a Bastiat license plate doesn't do much good, I can tell you.
But then there's the question of subsidy that I want to hear about. So,
well, Liberty Fund turned 50 in 2010, and it's very hard to measure our success. One way in which we can, in a sort of crude way, is there has been, in the last 20 years, a revival of interest in the writings of Adam Smith. A lot of books have been written about Adam Smith's philosophy and economics and so on. A lot of journal articles are published. And I would say that one factor in that renaissance of interest in Adam Smith was the Oxford University Press edition of his collected works, writings and correspondence, which was published in 1976 to coincide with the anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations. Oxford University Press is not a very entrepreneurial publisher, and they let the hardback edition go out of print. It was extremely expensive. Liberty Fund snapped up the paperback rights. So from about 1980 onwards, that's been one of our best-selling books. And anyone who writes on Adam Smith uses in their footnotes citations from our edition. What role did Liberty Fund play in this renaissance of interest in Adam Smith? I don't know. It's very hard to quantify. But it has coincided with this available edition, scholarly, critical, and we're hoping to do the same thing in other areas. We're republishing the works of Ludwig von Mises. We're republishing under license from the University of Chicago Press the works of Hayek. We were doing this Bastiat program. So we don't know what the effect of that will be, perhaps for another 20 years. But Liberty Fund has got deep pockets and a long time frame.
So it is underwritten
of course,
as an exercise.
Yes.
And channeled then through your co-author and other agencies in France.
Well,
how's it work?
How does Liberty Fund work?
No, I know Liberty. but getting the flow of the ideas back into France. I mean, it's not just totally left at random.
No, it's not. Yeah. There are entrepreneurial small publishing firms, for example. I was walking the streets of Paris with my daughter a month ago, And she wanted to do tourist things, and I know I got to go into bookshops. That's what I travel for, is go to the bookshops. But I couldn't, and eventually I talked her into letting me go into a bookshop, and I found half a shelf of books in French by Bastiat, translations of Rothbard and Rand, all done by 2 publishing companies. So there is a kind of revival going on, and they are getting their books into onto the bookshelves of Parisian bookshops. This was unheard of. Last time I was in Paris, there were no books by Bastiat or Rand or Rothbard on any French bookshelves. So that's an encouraging sign.
The last election cycle in France, they had a fake candidate. Frederic Bastiat ran for president. It was a very popular campaign.
Did he do better than Mickey Mouse?
Not sure. Yeah. But yeah, the ideas are there. So.
We have 2 hands up. Yes, sir. Back and then you.
Yeah, about 25 years ago when I was in college, just dating myself, I read Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville.
Yes.
Were they contemporaries, or were they opponents, or did they agree with one another?
They were in the chamber together, but Bastiat, being what we might call today a libertarian, didn't have an ideological home in the Chamber of Deputies. There was the sort of conservative liberals like Alexis de Tocqueville, and then there were the protectionists. And Bastiat was in the middle, and he disagreed with with both of them, but I think was the more consistent one. And then when the revolution occurred, you have a socialists now in the chamber. So it was sort of like 3 different groups and Bastiat. And a good example of how he was ideologically torn is the conservatives, like Alexis de Tocqueville, wanted to ban or keep the ban on workers forming unions, trade associations and so on. Bastiat said, no, we should allow workers to form unions because that's a form of voluntary association and they can do whatever they like. Form unions or not form unions, be a member or not be a member. So he sided with the left on the question of banning unions. However, when it came to government subsidies for the unemployed, he voted with the right and against the left. So he had to sit in the middle of the chamber because he didn't. And that to me is a fairly consistent libertarian position. You're neither with the left or with the right, because they both have exceptions which you can't, a true libertarian couldn't accept. So yes, he shared certain views with Tocqueville. They split on things like Algeria. Tocqueville was in favour of the Algerian colony. Bastiat totally opposed colonialism. He hated it with a passion. Said it's one of the worst crimes the Europeans have ever committed was colonising other parts of the world. So you can find quite a few issues where they're very different. Also, Bastiat was a Democrat, whereas Tocqueville was an aristocratic conservative liberal. There's a charming story in Democracy in America where you can see this aristocratic attitude of Tocqueville, where he couldn't understand why he was waiting for a coach to take him on part of his journey, and he wanted to sit in the most comfortable seat in the coach because he was an aristocrat. And of course in France all the common people defer to aristocrats. He said the Americans are just so pushy. They think just because they've bought a ticket they have the same right that you do to sit in the most comfortable seat in the carriage. He said this is a terrible thing about America. All these pushy Democrats who want to think that just because they bought the ticket they have a right to sit in the carriage.
Dr. Brandon, go ahead.
Sure. I was actually going to say the same thing, that I guess the Tocqueville was just slightly younger. And both of them died very young. I asked the relationship because I don't know enough about 19th century France, but there's such wonderful characters running around. But you're too modest about the Liberty Fund, because the translation of de Tocqueville, you have the edition of de Tocqueville which you all put together. So I was just going to say that seems to me the analog of what you're doing for Bastiat.
Oh, it's also the analog of what we did with Smith. I mean, what happened was that a critical edition was published in French, where the various editions and differences in the editions of Democracy in America were identified, and also remarks in his unpublished writings that were related to what was being said in Democracy in America are all brought into the footnotes. And then we got the right to translate that into English. So the version that we have is in fact unique because it is of the French critical edition, and it will be the edition for scholars to use.
And you have the French, and you publish the French.
In the book version, it's a side by side, the French on one page and the English on the other. But online, we only have the English. We didn't have the rights to the French. So on the OLL, it's just the English version.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hart.
Don't forget the discs and the catalogues if you wish.